Welcome to the European Law Unbound podcast series. I'm Maria Bartel, Professor of Transnational Private Law at the University of Amsterdam and the co-president pro tempore of the European Law Unbound Society. This podcast series was recorded in Prague during our inaugural conference in September 25, and we are thrilled to share it with you. In these episodes, you will discover fascinating law in Europe research from our many participants brought to life with their fresh impressions and insights from the conference itself. We hope you will enjoy these conversations as we look ahead to our second annual conference coming to Lisbon in September 26. Stay connected with us on LinkedIn to keep up with the latest news, updates and developments from the European Law Unbound Society. We are just getting started and we'd love to have you along for the journey.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of our podcast. My name is Michal Ria and I'm so happy that I've our guest today. We are recording again during the ELU conference 2025 Prague in September. So don't be confused that we are making more episodes during the semester. But I'm so happy that I have Vlad Perju here. He teaches European law in Harvard. And from my point of view, as somebody who's teaching EU law in Prague, it's something obvious that everybody within the European Union and its close neighborhood will be studying European law. But of course, teaching Americans EU law, it's something completely different. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
Vlad, can you explain us how much time do you have for EU law, whether it's mandatory? I guess it's not. It's elective. So how's the system of teaching EU law?
Yes, so let me tell you, so I will be basing this on my experience. I'm teaching this year as a visiting professor at Harvard. I've been teaching at Boston College for about 15 years or so. And I don't teach EU law every year. Mm-hmm. In the United States, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what courses we teach. But that being said, with some frequency, one has to teach courses that, one is... the other people cannot teach. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that I would have been teaching EU law, every 2-3 years or so. So quite a bit of experience. Mm-hmm. It is an upper level course, so it is very much optional. It is not offered to first year law students. In the United States, law is studied in 3 years. So basically you have what Americans call 2Ls and 3Ls taking this, as well as some graduate students who are interested, or master's students or doctoral students. And it very much depends on how many credits you teach this for. Mm-hmm. So I'm currently teaching it in a small introductory format of 2 credits, but I have also taught it in 3 credits and 4 credits. And the course, I've put together my own materials because one significant difference, I wouldn't call it a challenge necessarily, but one significant difference in teaching this in the US is that you have to teach it in a way that's comparable to how other courses mm-hmm. are taught. That doesn't mean, so in a sense, the European textbooks, which are wonderful and thoughtful and innovative and interesting and systematize the law in beautiful ways.
I'm starting to have a feeling you need to publish something soon.
Do not necessarily translate all that well to American law students because, they don't look like the case books that people are typically used to seeing. Not to say that, it cannot be taught in, using a European textbook. I've done it a number of times, but even there it has to be supplemented. So, mm-hmm. And supplemented with cases. American law students are used to reading cases. Mm-hmm. They are not used to having the subject matter being systematized. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes you see people coming from, international students, been really struck by both the method of instruction in the United States, as well as by the lack of the systematicity with which American law is being taught. We teach through cases, we teach through interesting cases. That means that you teach law at the appellate level. You teach exceptions, you teach the hard cases. and so many people coming from civil law countries are, and especially from Europe, find it striking.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, now I'm going back to the EU law part of it. There has to be cases in as some of the core materials. I had, in addition to cases, I have the systematization as well. So I'm also systematizing the subject matter so that they can get the flavor of both.
So some European vibe they get.
What's that?
They get some European vibe, European style education.
Yes. So they get a bit of everything. They get a bit of the American version. They get a bit of the European, because this is in a sense my experience. My experience is one in which, I studied in Europe. This is where I started my legal studies, and then I went to the United States where I did my doctorate, and I then started teaching. So I'm quite familiar with both systems of legal education. And I have found that, the conversation that people typically have had in comparative law about sort of different ways of just teaching law and approaching legal knowledge, while in an abstract way they are right. Nevertheless, when students learn, they need to have a combination of both. So common law students, American law students, need systematicity. They need to understand how the subject matter is actually put together, what the structure of it is. And teaching through cases doesn't give you that, which means that they basically have to do it on their own. Unless, the instructor provides some of that.
I'm trying to imagine that, and I'm just thinking because, for example, when we are in Prague, we are in the middle of 2-semester class, and first semester we are dealing with principles, applications, and institutions, while the second is mostly internal market. So, how, for example, it's hard to catch, for example, the institutions, the institutional relations through the case law.
Yes. So yes, very, very much so. So let me tell you how I do it a little bit. I mean, I can just answer the part about institutions, but let me tell you first some overview about how this is structured.
Thank you.
And so basically it starts with, so I start with, like an in-depth analysis of the Treaty of Rome, historical studies. Then I give the text, excerpts from the Treaty of Rome. And then the entire Fine and Loss case, and then, Costa, some of the early sort of foundational things. And this is session number 1, as well as a bit of a sort of comparison US, EU. Session number 2, what I do is that I do citizenship. Because, typically, as sort of we think about European integration as basically an economic project. But the fact of the matter is that this project has actually, transitioned to a very different, it has a very different,
it's much different,
much more compound. Yes.
Yeah.
And I want the students to have a sense of that. And so when we do citizenship, we just read, the sort of some of the law of names, the Garcia Velo case, we read Rothman, and we read, some of the social benefits cases, Troiani, and what comes after, what came before, as well as now sort of the Commission Against Malta. Just because it so happens that there are so many things that are now happening in European law that are just so transformational and interesting. And then session number 3 is political institutions, because those have to be introduced somehow. And, we introduce the political institutions through the treaty, and there are obviously some short excerpts from various books about the institutions. And then what I do with the institutions is that in the same session where they learn the basics of what's the Commission, what's the Council, and we have questions. Should the European Council be abolished? Should should the President of the Commission be directly elected? Questions about the nature of the reform, so that they understand what the debates are.
Do students, for example, compare it with the US system? So basically approaching as a federal system?
They inevitably do. I would imagine they inevitably do. I mean, this is always a very hard question. To what extent should they do that? To what extent is that helpful to do to that?
Because if I ask my students, at least in the beginning, they will definitely say that the European Commission is something like the government.
Right. So, sort of like step number one, is there some equivalent of the executive, but then it's got all these other powers in the areas where, that are massively integrated. And then so I teach it through sort of, I divide the idea of the democratic deficit into the old and the new. So in the old, so that they get an idea about institutional debates about institutional reform, politicizing the union, democratizing the institutions. We pay a lot of attention to the European Parliament. I tell them you understand a lot about the evolution of it through if you just look at the European Parliament. So that's sort of the old democratic deficit. But then we look at what Dan Kellerman and others call the new democratic deficit. That is the democratic backlash in Central and Eastern Europe. And then at that point, I introduce, we read basically about an excerpt, but it's still about 23 pages in total of the conditionality, of the new conditionality regulation. Because that, again, is extremely helpful, right? So that introduces them to the entire rule of law debate. We have a conversation. These are this is Article 7. These are the different tools in the toolbox. And there now is the conditioning, the financial, budgetary exercise to rule of law. So even there are court cases. If I had more time, but I don't, I would also be teaching them the all important, in my view, cases of the Court of Justice of empowering the European Parliament, sort of during the Rome period, telling the Parliament has standing to sue, to be sued, all those cases where the court is very much empowering the Parliament, because I think those are important cases, but we don't have time for that. And then after that, we just go into the, a study of the Court of Justice, a study of the jurisdiction. That's where we get preliminary references, which we already introduced in course now in the first unit. The discussion about what constitutes a court or tribunal, about judicial independence, all the recent innovative doctrine of the court. We look at standing. We now are looking at the question, again, pending before the court, of possibly opening up the standing for non-privileged applicants in climate litigation. Infringements, all that. And then we just get to sort of the constitutional piece of it, which is direct effect. A lot on primacy, including sort of the case law from Meloni, the decisions of the Polish court, of the Hungarian courts, of the German court, all that. So there we basically read, and we basically structure. I tend to have relatively strong views on this, but I'm structuring this in a way of this is one you can understand this case law and the relations between the Union and its member states through the paradigm of pluralism, or you can understand sort of the critique of pluralism. And already from the very first session, I give them a map that I put together myself. Is going to be in one of my writings, my publications, sort of that aims to sort of distinguish the different ages of European integration, sort of the Europe of Rome, which looks in one particular way, the Europe of Maastricht, and then the Europe of Lisbon. And hopefully that's a little bit helpful as they understand the different eras of European constitutionalism and European law. And then from there, just to complete all this, human rights, and then we do trade. We certainly discuss trade. That's important.
That's something which is probably the most important for somebody from abroad.
Yes, it's important. Yes, so we discuss sort of the external dimension as well. The union's exclusive competence in negotiating these big trade deals, but also the free movement of goods. There have been very few cases on the free movement of goods before the court in the last period, and there are all sorts of possible reasons for that. But of course, you need to understand mutual recognition. You need to understand and then it's basic. And then if we have time, of course, we're going to be looking a little bit at digital Europe, AI, sort of principles of regulation. And basically then, it's basically the student's role to try to put all this thing together. It helps to have a very detailed syllabus. So the syllabus by the end of this whole, course has lots of cases and lots of materials, and it's about 15 pages long. I don't know if we're going to be covering everything this year, but this is what you'd be doing, in my view, in like a 3-credit course. And then a 4-credit course allows you to do even more. But that's just dreaming.
So you have space to do everything.
Yeah, so there in 4 credits, you can really do interesting things. You can do, I mean, the stuff about administrative law, about new governance. I've told students about it, and this is what I try to do as I teach, which is that I try to flag different directions that we cannot possibly take, but that they might be interested in, because there are people who might, be very interested in sort of innovations in, administrative law, or sort of materially different struggles for recognition of persons with disabilities, or so. And then there's a lot in EU law that is interesting and relevant and innovative. And for that, we can just meet individually and we talk about it, and we put together a reading list. So people, and and on occasion, people do that. They want to read more. They find it interesting, and they want to have more of it.
And do, for example, your students understand understand the probably different philosophical approaches to certain areas? Because recently, for example, Vice President J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, when he was talking about how freedom of speech is not working in Europe and there is a censorship similar to Soviet style, which is especially for people who experience that a little more than a little offensive, then we just have different kind of freedom of speech. Is it something they are struggling with?
Yeah, I also teach comparative constitutional law. So, of course, freedom of speech, and especially hate speech and different ways of understanding freedom of speech is a very...
Because this is a huge issue also in trade, basically. If you are speaking about digital regulation, that's one of the biggest obstacles in cooperation.
Yes, and it's becoming a very big issue everywhere. I mean, in American constitutional law, for example, I teach questions of federalism and separation of powers. And then
you have a lot of materials now.
Yeah, there are a lot of materials. There's a lot going on. But what I meant to say is that there's a way in which the doctrine of the First Amendment, which includes freedom of speech, is developing in ways that makes it very relevant to constitutional structure. So it tended to be the case that constitutional lawyers would almost have like 2 different tracks of thinking. One is the structure, the other one is rights. Now the two have been combined from the very start, but nevertheless, one's attention was drawing more in one direction or the other. Now it's really not possible anymore. So you really cannot quite understand what's happening in American federalism or in separation of powers unless you see a little bit of the development of the doctrines of free speech. So going back to your question about different approaches to free speech, certainly that is crucial. It doesn't come up, in a 2-credit course, it's very hard to make it come up. It might be that students are interested and they're going to be asking about it and they're going to be talking about it. There was a lot in Vice President Vance's speech. There were references to Romania. Romania is a jurisdiction that I'm very familiar with about the cancellation of the European of the presidential elections in Romania. So there's a lot there. Look, to the extent that this is drawing students to comparative courses, European Union law or comparative constitutional law or what have you, I'll be happy to discuss it and teach them. And I think that this is the more people are interested in how law works elsewhere, the better. I think it's absolutely critical. And this is a lesson that we know as Europeans, right? It's just impossible now to do, you study at Charles University, you don't study just the constitutional law of the Czech Republic, right? It's...
For me, very interesting or important message was in the first lecture in the first year, where Professor Selterreich had started a lecture in legal history with example of when you are living all your life in a red room, you won't know that it's red because you've never seen anything else.
Right.
For many of my students, it's hard to understand the binding nature of the ECJ case law because we are using the term semi-presidential. We are in the part of Europe when presidents are not really natural, let's say. So suddenly there is something semi-preferential, and actually, what does it mean that it's semi? Something like, but your students are people from common law traditions. So do they understand the difference, or is there a difference for them? Actually, that's my question.
Difference in terms of what?
What does it mean to have a precedent ruling in the US and in the ECJ?
You mean, at the level of courts, of course, we talk about in what sense is the Court of Justice different from,
Supreme Court,
any other court, including the Supreme Court. And they understand that. I mean, this is, the judges coming from different legal traditions. I tell them, because I have to explain why the cases read the way they do, especially the early cases, right? I tell them that it was all happening in French. They were written in French. They were translating into some kind of English, translating to better English after the UK became a member.
Judges were a little shorter.
Yes, yes, and I do say that it is not to underestimate how important the language is. What the relation. I myself wrote an article early in my career about this, sort of the relation between the form and the substance of the judgment. So language is very important.
It's important also to note that the language, because when we are talking about English, European English is different from the British English, or when I always, for students, I need to explain them that the words we are using in the Czech is different from the European Czech because the content might be different.
Yes, very much, very much. Some comparative law scholars refer to this as modularity, right? That there is a way in which these legal concepts are modular, and you have to understand them in the larger context in which they exist. I mean, a lot of comparative law is really about that, right? Like the debate about legal transplants is, can there be legal transplants, or is it that by the time the particular legal institution has made it to the host state, it's changed so fundamentally because it was taken out of context, and you can't transplant context. So, there's a lot of that. Now, the European law is far more, is a site where comparative law debates should be really tested, because, it's like it appears to be working, and it's been working for a long time. And not only is it working, it seems, it's one of the most successful experiments in sort of supranational adjudication in the history of the world. So clearly they're doing something well. But it's an intriguing question how it works. So students are always very interested in the logistics of it, and of course there is the question of, there are no separate opinions. Like, how can there be no separate opinions? What is this? I mean, obviously there's disagreement within that court. Like, what's the conception of law behind it? And I think it's important to explain it, but not to explain it in a way that is sort of, necessitarian, that this is the only way.
It's like that.
Yeah, it's like that, and that's just what it is. I mean, you have to explain that it's like that in the sense that people believe that that's the case. And so, it's the way that, people at Oxford after the war were asking themselves, why is French music like that? Why does it sound like that? It's the same thing here, like how can anyone believe that law is that? Well, they can. Like, this is what it means to think about different, people doing law elsewhere. At the same time, it's a very real, serious question for how much longer the Court of Justice can proceed without separate opinions. I mean, I personally think that it would be a much stronger court, much stronger, and European doctrine would be much better. And
don't you think that the lawyers in the member states would need to understand that the fact that there are different opinions, the decision is still there?
I mean, we've people understand this in other parts of the world. There is no reason why, and they certainly understand that at the national level, right? There are many courts that allow separate opinions, including constitutional courts. So, there is no reason why they couldn't quite understand at the level of the Court of Justice. And, we've seen benefits. It strengthens it, and it gives it a sense of credibility. There is, you take a decision like Commission against Malta. Whatever you might think about it, there were dissents in that court. I hope there were dissents in that court. I would like to see those dissents, and then I would like to see the majority responding to the dissents, and that would have made the decision stronger, even if the votes had still been, in favor of, you know,
what is that? Yeah.
What they just, like letting, like the declaratory judgment that Malta was in violation of its obligations on the European law. So even if the final vote had been the same, I still think that the judgment would have been much stronger. It's true that, like in European law, things sediment, they settle in a particular way. So it's the particular empirical community that provides this function of checking and criticism. But I do think that it would strengthen the court much more.
Are students still, actually not your students, but are the students in the US still interested in studying EU law? So there are geopolitical changes and switches, so the Euro-Atlantic bonds are not as strong as it used to be. Also, the composition of population in the US is changing from WASPs people to more diverse. So are they still interested to study law from the old small continent of only 500 million people?
Some are. I think that many more would benefit from it.
Okay.
But I think you're right. There is a lot that's going on in the world, and people are interested in law in elsewhere, in addition to the United States, China and Africa and NAFTA, whatever. There's a lot of things that are going on that are very important. So I don't mean to suggest that this is, in some absolute way of greater importance. That being said, I have been, trying to tell people that European law is a very special kind of construct, that it's very innovative, that it is now going through a period of, I would call it effervescence, but maybe that's too strong a word, of sort of innovation and reconstruction that in substance, and we'll see about effect, but at least in substance, is comparable to the foundational period of European law in the 1960s and 70s. I deeply believe that. And so if there'd ever been a moment to pay a lot of attention to it, it would be now. I think there was a lot of interest in European law after the fall of the Berlin Wall, sort of around the time of the Treaty of Maastricht. And then the interest started to go down a little bit. And now I hope it's going to be picking up again, because I think people in the United States, especially in the legal world, have realized that there are particular synergies between law in Europe and law in the United States in all sorts of ways. So yeah, I hope there's room for even more interest. Let me just put it diplomatically.
Okay, that was the end of our interview. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much, Mikhail. Thank you very much. I had a wonderful time.
See you in Portugal.
Yes.
At least.
Yes, exactly.